All right, in this video, we're going to be discussing Mexico, the second of our countries this year. And of the AP6, one of the two that are classified as a transitioning or developing or illiberal democracy. So Mexico's political history is really, really fascinating. And what we've seen in the past 20 years is a transition from where it was mostly throughout the 20th century of, technically speaking, an authoritarian regime, kind of a one-party state, to a more developed democracy. So a lot of positive things have happened within Mexico in terms of the development of democracy in the last 20 years, but it still technically falls in the category of illiberal democracy. And I think the Freedom House score is somewhere in the mid 60s. But we've seen a lot of a lot of the institutional improvements that have taken place in Mexico have taken place in the last 20 years. So a very young democracy as well. And developing politically and also developing economically speaking. So Mexico is also categorized as a developing country or a newly industrializing country. So one thing we'll see within this unit is some of the politics of things in developing countries are different than things in the United States. So we'll talk a lot about kind of use of natural resources and oil production and sort of the politics of natural resources within Mexico. And we'll also talk about the big economic differences that exist within parts of the country, and how a lot of the North represents kind of this globalizing industrial, or part of the global system, industrial powerhouse, part of the global economy, part of the country, and then other parts of Mexico are much poorer, much more based in agriculture, and have much more of many of the characteristics of a less developed country. So, as in most developing countries, a lot of economic differences exist within the country. And overall, kind of a GDP per capita of around $15,000 or $16,000. So Mexico's structure of government is going to resemble the United States in a lot of ways. So we're going to teach Mexico and Nigeria together, and both of those countries are going to be classified as federal states, right? So they both intentionally, within their constitution, delegate powers to different levels of government, which make them federal states. But in both cases, we're going to see a more of a consolidation of power at the central government level, meaning they have kind of weak, ineffective local governments or state governments, and essentially kind of a little bit of a power vacuum between the two levels of government. So the federal government ends up being, or the central government ends up being stronger than it constitutionally probably should be. And a lot of that has to do with the lack of state capacity that exists at local and federal level, or local and state levels within Mexico, and also Nigeria as well. So Mexico is divided into 31 states and has a federal district, Mexico City. So we will see a lot of that structure within some of the institutions of government. So I think a total of 96 senators. Off the top of my head, it's either 93 or 96. So we'll talk about sort of what we see in terms of how the federal structure sort of translates institutionally for Mexico. So, and like the United States, Mexico is a strong presidential system. So we have talked about China, which is sort of presidential in name only, in that they have a president, but not really a presidential system. So Mexico is a really strong presidential system, where strong presidential powers, even probably stronger than the United States, are given, because Mexico has a history of consolidation of power at the top of government. Guess who's at the top of government? It's the president. So Mexico has really strong presidential powers, in kind of throughout the course of the 20th century. Some of the most important powers have been kind of overseeing a really intricate patronage system within the country. So a lot of things related to civil society are kind of connected to the president, and that's changing a lot as Mexico develops politically. You're seeing a transition in terms of civil society. So things like political parties and labor groups and things like that are not as connected to the government as they once were. But still, the president has a strong role in sort of overseeing all of these different groups, in addition to having lots and lots of power. So, oh, and one thing I didn't mention, I should right here. And one thing Mexico does that's really interesting is it term limits the president, where they have 1 6-year term. So write that down. I didn't write that down on this. I should have. 1 6-year term. So that is going to be really interesting. So Mexico delegates lots and lots and lots of power to the president, but it has one term of 6 years. So it's it has some really, really interesting effects. So we'll get to see some about the effects of term limits. All right, so going on, Mexico has a bicameral legislature structured in a lot of ways like the United States. So the lower house is called the Chamber of Deputies, and the upper house is called the Senate. And some difference is kind of the electoral system. The way that they elect the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate is different than the United States. So we'll talk about the kind of electoral process within that. And what we have seen is Mexico has, kind of due to its separation of powers, it has what should be an independent judiciary and a legislature that functions the same way as the U.S., kind of checks of power and a clear separation of powers. It is not quite there. The executive power still has a lot of power within Mexico. The executive branch still has a lot of power within Mexico. But we have seen the legislature and the judiciary both start to assert their independence more as Mexico develops as a democracy. So we mentioned this a little bit, but Mexico is moving in terms of its civil society and how interest groups work within the country, from alignment kind of with the government to a more pluralistic system in which civil society groups sort of act independently and sort of compete for power with each other, but is still not quite what we would call pluralistic. Talking a few more things, Mexico has a multi-party system. So its electoral system is different than the US. And we'll talk about the connection between electoral systems and the amount of political parties. But they're kind of in a period of transition. I think they're going to end up with 3 political coalitions, kind of a center-right party, a more populist left party, and sort of the traditional party that called the PRI, which we will talk a lot about. I'm not going to get into them yet. But Mexico has a history of one-party dominance. So they have, as they've developed democratically, they've transitioned from a one party, which was the PRI, throughout most of the 20th century, having a lot of power, to a system in which political parties, usually 3 different political parties, are competing in elections. And the last thing we'll talk about a lot with Mexico and Nigeria are within developing countries. What are the threats to state sovereignty and state legitimacy that exist? So within Mexico, a lot of things that you hear about in the news, drug cartels, sort of separatist movements within Mexico that have popped up, and really corruption is probably drug violence and corruption are probably the 2 most endemic issues within Mexican politics. So as Mexico develops politically, will that result in improvements for Mexican citizens, or will these things like corruption and drug violence, will that stifle sort of the politics of the country, to where that kind of improvements are not felt for citizens? I think that's the $1,000 question. I don't know if that's what you say, but $1,000 question. We'll go with that. So thinking about the geography of Mexico, we'll zoom through this a little bit. So Mexico is geographically really diverse. So there's a lot of stuff in Mexico. That's not a very technical description, but a lot of natural resources, a lot of oil, a lot of precious metals, a lot of really interesting ways in which natural resource issues become political issues within Mexico. So obviously the border with the United States is a really, really important source of political tension and political discussion. Also a really, really, the proximity to the United States also has a lot of connections to economic development within the country. So you see a lot of the northern parts of Mexico much, much, much more well off than other parts of Mexico. And kind of, we also will talk about the south of Mexico, how the immigration, Mexico acts as both a source of migration to the United States, but also as a destination for a lot of migrants from other poor countries in Central America. So Mexico has its sort of own immigration issues and ways in which it functions differently than you might think. When thinking about immigration. All right, so as we said, the president has a lot of power in Mexico. So when we talk about Mexico, we talk a lot about the president. So that guy right now is AMLO. He's the one here, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. So he is kind of the latest in line in the presidency. So he's 2 years into his 6-year term. So we'll talk a lot about his progress so far, a lot about some of the threats to his accomplishments, or some of the things that haven't gone as well. So coronavirus has been a big issue in Mexico, and sort of the inability to tackle coronavirus so far has been a big problem. So we'll talk about that. And then the past three guys, you'll see kind of the presidents and the modern era of Mexican politics. So since the regime change in 2000, in which Mexico transitioned from a kind of permanently, I don't know, permanently, but kind of permanently transitioned from authoritarian regime to democracy. These guys have been the four presidents that we have seen. So Vicente Fox, Felipe Calderon, Enrique Peña Nieto, and then the guy we have now, AMLO. All right. And you can see within Mexico, often, and we talked about this when we talked about social cleavages, oftentimes there is a cleavage in which kind of southern parts of Mexico, less developed parts of Mexico, support more left-oriented political parties. Northern Mexico tends to be more center-right. What we see so you can kind of see that in some of the past elections with the PRI sprinkled about. And what we see in the most recent one is a landslide victory for AMLO. So talking about him is really important. He is the central political figure in Mexican politics right now. He's going to be in power for a lot longer, till 2024. So we'll talk about what is kind of happening within his presidency, as well as sort of what the Mexican president traditionally does. All right, thanks. Bye.